The wind came down out of the dark like something alive, and it was looking for a way in. It found cracks. It found doors. It found the gaps no one had ever bothered to seal. One by one, the houses in the valley began to lose their warmth. But there was one cabin the cold could not touch. A strange little house, buried under a shell of dead flowers. For a whole year, they had laughed at the old woman who built it, called her foolish, called her broken by grief. They said flowers could never hold back winter. Now the worst storm any of them had ever seen was screaming against her walls. And inside, a child slept warm, while the rest of the valley froze in the dark. They were about to learn what she had really been building, and why. One spring, in a high valley where the wind never fully rested, a woman knelt in the cold dirt and began to plant flowers. Not in a garden, not along a fence. She pressed the seeds into the soil right against the walls of her cabin, so close that her knuckles brushed the bottom logs as she worked. Her name was Nell Bramwell. She was 58 years old, and the valley had already decided what she was: a widow, a woman alone. And now, it seemed, a woman who had finally lost her good sense to grief, because no one with sense planted sunflowers against the side of a house. The seeds went in one by one, north wall, south wall, every side, a narrow ring of them, circling the whole cabin like a thread drawn tight around something fragile. Behind her came a small girl with a cloth sack of seeds clutched to her chest. Wren, 8 years old, with wind-tangled hair and serious eyes. She followed her grandmother step by step, dropping seeds into the little holes Nell pointed to, never once asking why. And near the doorway, in a patch of pale morning sun, an old brown dog lay watching them both. Barley, gray around the muzzle now, slow to rise, but he never let the woman or the child out of his sight. That was the picture. That first spring morning, an old woman, a small girl, a tired old dog, and a ring of buried seeds that made no sense at all. People noticed. In that high country, every warm day was worth its weight in gold. Roofs needed mending. Wood needed splitting. There was always more work than there was light to do it in. So when a wagon rolled past and the driver saw a grown woman spending her precious daylight planting flowers against a wall, he slowed. He stared. And then he carried the story onward, the way men carry stories when they have nothing kinder to do with their tongues. It reached the trading post first, then the meeting hall, then the long, idle afternoons where folks gathered and talked about everything except their own troubles. A rancher named Cyrus Dunmore heard it and laughed through his nose. A carpenter named Abel Caro, who had raised more cabins than he could count, simply shook his head. "Flowers," he said, "don't keep out winter." And everyone agreed. So they gave the place a name. The Sunflower Widow's Cabin. Nell heard it. Of course she heard it. The valley was too small for a thing like that to stay hidden. But she said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just went on pressing seeds into the cold spring earth, one after another, while the laughter drifted across the fences and faded into the wind. And maybe that was the strangest part of all. Not the flowers, the silence. Because a guilty woman explains herself. A foolish woman defends herself. But Nell Bramwell did neither. She only worked. Inside the cabin, the world was quieter. There was a coat hanging behind the door. A man's coat. Heavy wool, worn soft at the elbows, the collar shaped by years of one particular neck. It had not been moved in a long time. Beside the stove leaned an old axe, its handle smooth where a strong hand used to hold it. That had not been moved either. The man they belonged to was named Asa, and Asa was gone. The girl, Wren, knew not to touch those things. She had learned it the way children learn the shape of a house, without ever being told that coat, that axe, they were not furniture. They were a door that stayed shut. One evening, when the last light was bleeding out of the sky and the new seeds slept beneath the soil, Wren stood at the window and looked out at the dark ring of earth around the cabin. "Grandma," she said softly, "would Grandpa have liked the flowers?" Nell's hands went still over the cord she'd been winding. Outside, the wind pushed against the glass. The dog lifted his head, and for a long moment, the woman did not answer at all. She looked at the window. She looked at the coat behind the door, and something moved behind her eyes that the child was too young to name. "Go to bed, sweet girl," was all she finally said. The question hung in the room long after the lamp went out, because here was the thing no one in the valley understood. The flowers were not for spring. They were not for color, or beauty, or the small vanity of a woman who wanted her home to look pretty. The flowers were for winter. Years before, when the valley was young and Asa was still warm beside her, Nell had heard stories from the old woman who had raised him. A woman from somewhere far away. The old country, they called it. A place of long, cruel winters and people who had learned, over generations, how to outlast them. Those people did something with sunflowers that no one in this valley would think to do. They grew them, yes. They took the seeds. But the plants themselves, the tall dried stalks, the broad spent heads, the brittle leaves, those they saved. They stacked them around cellars, around smokehouses, around the shelters where the animals waited out the cold. The old woman never called it a lesson. She just said it once, with her hands busy and her eyes far away. "The cold hunts walls," she said. "Give it something else to find first." At the time, it had sounded like an old saying, a bit of folklore, the kind that passes from one generation to the next and means nothing until the day it means everything. Nell had not thought of those words in years, until one winter changed everything, because there had been a night, a hard, screaming night, when the wind found every weakness this little cabin had. The chinking had shrunk in the summer heat. There were gaps no one had noticed. Cold poured through them like water through a cracked dam, and the fire could not keep up. That was the night the woodpile ran low. That was the night a strong man pulled on his heavy wool coat and took up his smooth-handled axe, and went out into the dark to find more wood for his family. That was the night Asa did not come back. They found him when the storm finally broke. Not far. That was the cruelest part. Not far from the door at all. The cold had not needed to chase him across the valley. It had only needed a house that could not hold its warmth, and one man brave enough, or desperate enough, to step outside. Nell had buried her husband, and then, in time, she had buried the strength to think about it. But the words of the old woman stayed. The cold hunts walls. Give it something else to find first. So now, there was a child in the house Again. Wren. Behind him, Posey began to cry quietly into her scarf. Marin walked the outside of the cabin while the last light drained away. And on the north side, she found the worst of it. That whole wall had nearly disappeared, buried under packed dirt and dead roots and old drifted snow gone hard as stone. The place did not look abandoned. It looked buried. Not while there was breath in her body and a single thing left to try. That was what the flowers were. Not decoration, not the strange hobby of a grieving woman. They were a wall she was going to grow, season by season, out of the same earth that had once taken everything from her. A second skin for the house. A promise made in seeds. But the valley could not see any of that. They saw an old woman on her knees in the dirt. They saw wasted daylight and foolish flowers, and a widow too broken to know better. They laughed. They named her. And they went back to their own warm enough houses, certain that the first hard wind would teach the sunflower widow her lesson. What none of them knew, what not one soul in that whole valley could have guessed, was that the wind was already coming. And when it came, it would not be gentle. It would not be patient. It would come to test every wall in the basin, every joint, every gap, every quiet decision a person had made when no one was watching. And on that day, the laughter would stop. But that was still months away. For now, there was only a woman, a child, a dog, and a ring of buried seeds, waiting in the cold ground for their season to come. The seeds did not stay buried for long. By the time the days grew long and the light turned gold, green shoots had pushed up all around the cabin, a thin living fringe pressed tight against the old gray logs. They grew fast, faster than anyone in the valley had expected. And as they grew, so did the talk. Every wagon that rolled past slowed a little. Every rider turned his head. There was the sunflower widow's place, they would say to one another. And there were her foolish flowers, climbing higher week by week, leaning in close against the walls, as if the house itself had begun to sprout. Nell paid the talk no mind. She rose before the sun. She carried water from the creek in the cool blue hour before the heat. 2 heavy pails balanced against the ache in her shoulders, and she poured it slow at the roots so none of it ran to waste. She pulled the weeds that tried to crowd the young stalks, and she taught the child to do the same. Wren learned the work without complaint. She was a quiet girl, watchful, the kind of child who had learned too early that the world could take things from you. And so she held what she loved very carefully. She learned which leaves were healthy and which were sick. She learned how deep the water needed to soak before the soil went dark. She learned to step softly between the rows, the way her grandmother did, as if the plants were something more than plants, as if they were listening. And the old dog, Barley, learned his own work too. He learned to chase the rabbits off at dawn. He learned to lean his graying weight against a wandering sheep and steer it away from the tender stalks. He learned to lie at the edge of the rows in the heat of the afternoon, one ear always turned back toward the woman and the child, the way a tired old soldier keeps watch even in his sleep. To anyone passing on the road, it looked like a strange little family, tending a stranger little garden. But Nell Bramwell was not gardening. She was building. She simply had not shown them the shape of it yet. The evenings were the best part. When the worst of the heat had broken, She and the child would sit on the worn step of the cabin with the dog stretched out between them, and they would watch the sun go down behind the high ground. Sometimes Wren asked questions, small ones at first. Why do the flowers face the sun? Why do you tie them together? Why don't you plant them out in the field, where everyone else puts their flowers? And Nell would answer the small ones plainly. The flowers face the sun because they love it. They are tied together so the wind cannot take them one at a time. And they are planted against the house because that is where they are needed. She never said more than that. Not yet. Some truths a child has to grow into. But other evenings, the child asked the bigger questions, the ones that came out soft, almost shy, as if she already knew they might hurt. Did Grandpa sit out here too? And Nell's hands would go still in her lap. The light would catch the lines in her face, deep now, carved by more sorrow than one woman ought to carry. He did, she would say at last. Right there, where you're sitting. And then she would say no more, and the child would lean against her side, and the two of them would watch the dark come down over the valley together. Two people the world had whittled down to almost nothing, holding on to the small, warm thing that was left. That was what the valley could not see when they laughed. They saw a foolish old woman and a ring of weeds. They did not see the love holding it all up. By high summer, the sunflowers stood taller than the child, then taller than the woman. Their broad golden faces turned to follow the sun across the sky, and from the road, the whole cabin seemed wrapped in a ring of light, as if something holy had taken root around the plain little house. It was almost beautiful, almost enough to make a body forget there was anything strange about it at all. And then the wind came. It came down off the high ground one afternoon with no warning. One moment the air hung still and heavy, the kind of stillness that makes the back of your neck prickle. The next, the whole valley was bending. Dust rolled across the open flats in long brown waves. Loose boards tore loose and went tumbling. A length of old fence near the creek gave way with a crack like a breaking bone. And the sunflowers, the tall, proud, golden sunflowers, bent and could not bend back. When the wind finally eased and the dust began to settle, Nell came out to find nearly a third of the western row lying flat against the ground. Broken stalks, snapped stems, bright heads crushed into the dirt like fallen soldiers after a battle no one had even seen. A whole side of her strange wall, the work of a whole season, ruined in the space of an afternoon. She stood there a long moment in the settling dust. She did not cry out. She did not curse. She simply looked at the wreckage with a stillness that ran deeper than despair. And Wren came and stood beside her and slipped a small hand into hers. "Can we fix it, Grandma?" Nell looked down at the child, then back at the ruin. "We can," she said. "We will." It so happened that the carpenter, Abel Caro, was riding the road nearby when the wind passed. He drew his horse up short and looked at the flattened row for a good long while. Then he shook his head, slow and sure. "Knew it," he said. "To no one. To everyone." And he rode on to carry the news the way men carry news when they would rather be right than be kind. It spread faster than the storm had. By that evening, half the valley had heard. The widow's flowers were down. The foolishness was finished at last. Most folks figured the rest of the rows would follow with the next hard blow, and that would be the merciful end of the whole peculiar business. Some of them even felt a little sorry for her. A grieving old woman, they said, shaking their heads, chasing a fancy to fill the empty house, bound to fail. They went to their beds that night, certain the matter was settled. But the wind does not get the last word so easily. Not against a woman like Nell Bramwell. She was out before the sun the next morning. Before the light had even touched the ridgeline, before the child had woken, she was on her knees in the ruined western row with her hands deep in the cold dirt. One by one, she lifted the fallen stalks. The ones that could be saved, she straightened and braced with fresh stakes driven hard into the earth. The ones broken past saving, she pulled and set aside, and replaced from the bundles she had kept in reserve. And then she did something she had not done before. She took lengths of cord, and she began to tie the rows to one another, stalk to stalk, row to row, so that when the next wind came, and it would come, no single plant would have to stand against it alone. They would share the weight. They would lean into one another and hold. The work took days. Her old hands cracked and bled at the knuckles. Her back seized up so badly some mornings she had to brace herself against the wall just to rise. The sun burned the back of her neck, and the cord wore grooves into her palms. Wren carried the stakes and the cord, back and forth, without being asked twice. Barley circled the rows, keeping the sheep from blundering into the fragile new ties, and Nell worked from first light to last, slow and steady and silent, until the thing was done. By the end of the week, the western row stood again. It was not the same as it had been. It was lower in places, patched, mended, a little crooked where the new stalks didn't quite match the old. But it was stronger. Anyone who knew how to look could see it. The way the rows held each other up now. The way the whole wall had learned, in a single hard week, to bend without breaking. Abel Caro rode past again 2 days later and saw it standing. He did not say anything this time, but he slowed his horse a good deal longer than he meant to. And somewhere behind his weathered eyes, a small question opened up, one he was not yet ready to ask out loud. The thing about that western row falling was that it handed the carpenter the opening he had been waiting for. A few days on, he stopped at the Bramwell place while Nell was working along the north wall, winding cord between two tall stalks with hands that had not yet healed. He didn't climb down from the saddle right away. He just sat there, one arm resting easy on the horn, and looked the whole strange wall over from one corner to the next. Abel Caro had raised more cabins than any man in the valley. Some of them still stood. A few had outlasted winters hard enough to become stories told around the fire on cold nights. When that man spoke about wood, people listened. "You're making trouble for yourself," he said at last. Nell kept working. The cord passed through her sore fingers, over and under, steady as a heartbeat. He nodded toward the dry-tipped stalks pressed against the logs. "Those things will hold the wet against your walls," he said. "Wet gets down into the wood. Wood goes soft. Then it isn't flowers you're fighting anymore. It's a whole side of your house gone to rot." His eyes dropped lower to the base of the wall. "And the mice," he went on. "They'll come. They always come. Give them that much cover, that much warmth packed up against the logs, and they'll move in before the first hard frost and never trouble themselves to leave. It was a good argument. That was the trouble with it. Every word the man said was true. Every soul in that valley knew damp wood failed. Every family had fought the mice at one time or another, and most of them had lost more than they cared to say. Nothing he said came from meanness. It came from a lifetime of building things that had to last through weather that did not forgive mistakes. He leaned forward a little in the saddle. "Wood needs to breathe, Nell," he said, and his voice had gone almost gentle now. "You're smothering your own house. A man hates to watch it." For the first time, her hands went still. She looked at the wall she had grown and broken and mended across a whole long season. Then she looked, slow, at the cabin standing behind it, at the old gray logs, at the gaps she knew were there, the ones no eye could find from the road, the ones she thought about every night before she slept. A breeze moved through the leaves above her head. Out back, Barley barked once at a sheep that had drifted too near. Abel waited for her answer. What he got instead was the sight of her turning back to her work. The cord passed through her fingers again. Over. Under. The conversation was finished. To the carpenter, that silence did not look like confidence. It looked like stubbornness. The hard, blind stubbornness of an old woman too proud to admit she'd lost her way. He rode off more certain than ever that winter would settle the whole argument for him, one way or another. But the silence had cost her more than the man could know. Because the trouble with a true thing said out loud is that it stays with you long after the one who said it has gone. That night, Nell lay awake and turned his words over and over in the dark. Wet gets in the wood. Mice always come. You're smothering your own house. She knew wood rotted. She had pulled enough soft, ruined timber out of enough old buildings in her long life to know exactly what the man meant. What if he was right? What if the very thing she had built to keep them safe was the thing that would fail them, quietly, from the outside in, when the cold finally came to call? She lay there a long while, staring at the dark ceiling. And the worst part of it all was this: there was no one left to ask. But the carpenter was not the only one watching the widow and her wall. There was another man in the valley whose attention was worth a great deal more than his, and a great deal more dangerous. His name was Cyrus Dunmore, and Cyrus Dunmore did not deal in opinions. He dealt in flour and salt and dried beans and cordwood and credit. When the cold months came and a family's stores ran thin, it was Dunmore they went to, hats in hand. It was his book their names went down in. It was his goodwill, or his sour mood, that decided whether a household ate well and burned warm, or went without when the snow lay deep across the valley. A man like that did not need a loud voice. He had something far better. He had the power to say no. He came to the Bramwell place on a gray, low-skied afternoon, riding slow, taking his time, looking at the wall the way a man looks at something he means to charge a price for. Nell straightened from her work and met him at the edge of the rows. She did not invite him closer. "Folks are talking," Dunmore said. "Folks always talk," she answered. "They're talking about you." He let that sit a moment, his eyes drifting over the wall and then, deliberately, toward the cabin door. About the widow who'd sooner grow weeds against her house than keep a decent home. About the little girl living in the middle of all of it. The mention of the child, that was no accident. Nell's jaw tightened, just the smallest bit. Wren is fed, she said quietly. Wren is warm, and Wren is no concern of yours. Everything in this valley is my concern when the cold comes, Dunmore said. You'll be at my counter, same as everybody else, same as always, askin' for what your little garden can't give you. He let the words hang in the air between them. Then he leaned down from the saddle, close enough that she could see the cold patience in his eyes. Pull these down, he said. All of them. Stop making a spectacle of yourself in front of the whole valley. Stop dragging that child through your foolishness, and your name stays in good standing in my book. He paused. Keep on with it, and maybe come the deep cold, my flowers all spoken for, my wood as well. Maybe there's nothing left when you finally come asking. A man can only carry so many accounts on his shelves. There it was, plain as the gray sky behind his head. Not a joke this time, not idle laughter drifting from the trading post. A threat. Pull down the wall, or risk the very things that would carry the child through the dark months. Nell looked up at him for a long, level moment. The wind moved through the dead-tipped flowers. Behind her, Barley had gone very still, his ears flat against his skull, a low rumble building deep in his chest. You would starve a child, she said, not loud, almost soft, to win yourself an argument about flowers. I do business, Dunmore said, with people who've got sense. He straightened back up in the saddle and gathered his reins. You think on it. Winter's a long season to be on the wrong side of my book. And he rode away, without waiting for an answer. Because to a man like Cyrus Dunmore, the answer was never truly in question. He had decided what she was, just like all the rest of them. A foolish old woman who would come crawling when the snow began to fall. That was the night the doubt got its claws in deep. After the child was asleep, Nell sat alone by the dying fire and let herself feel the whole weight of it for the first time. She had told no one why she was doing this. She had let them laugh. She had let them name her. She had borne all of it in silence, because the silence had felt like the only scrap of dignity she had left in the world. But now, it was not only her dignity on the scales. It was the child. She looked across the dim room at the small shape under the blankets, the tangle of hair on the pillow, the slow, easy breathing of a girl who trusted, completely and without question, that the woman in this house knew exactly what she was doing. What if she didn't? What if Abel Caro was right and the wall would rot the house out from under them? What if Cyrus Dunmore meant every word and there would be nothing at all in his book when the cold came, because a stubborn old woman had chosen her pride over her grandchild's empty belly? She looked at the coat behind the door. Heavy wool, worn soft at the elbows, shaped still by the man who used to fill it. I don't know what I'm doing, she whispered to it. Asa, I swear to you, I don't know. The fire popped and settled. The wind pressed at the walls, searching the way it always searched. The coat said nothing, the way it always said nothing. And in that long, dark hour, Nell Bramwell came nearer than she ever came to pulling the whole thing down, to kneeling in the dirt one last time and tearing out every stalk she had ever planted, to walking up to Cyrus Dunmore's door with her head bowed low, just the way he expected her to. It would have been easier. It would have been safer. It would have been the sensible thing, and not one soul in the valley would have blamed her for it. But then she remembered the old woman's hands, years gone now, busy with some small task by a long cold fire, eyes far away, voice low and certain. The cold hunt's walls. Give it something else to find first. That woman had not been a fool. That woman had come from a country of winters this soft valley could not even dream of, and she had lived to be old and gray and wise, and she had passed on what she knew the only way that wisdom is ever truly handed down, not as a lecture, but as a memory that lies quiet inside you until the very day you need it most. Nell had needed it once before, and she had remembered it too late. She was not going to be too late again. She did not pull the wall down. She banked the fire low. She drew the blanket up over the sleeping child's shoulder, and she lay down in the dark with her doubt curled beside her like a cold animal. And she chose, anyway, to go on. Sometimes that is all courage ever is, not the absence of fear, just the refusal to quit while you are still afraid. When the days began to shorten and the mornings turned sharp with frost, the real work began at last. The bright faces of the sunflowers faded and browned, their heavy heads bowed toward the earth, fat with seed. The green went brittle. The stalks hardened day by day into something more like wood than weed. To most folks, that was the end of a sunflower's use. To Nell, it was only the beginning. She harvested part of the seed and stored it away in cloth sacks, set back careful for the spring that would follow. But the rest of the plants she left standing, because every one of them had another purpose now. Over the long weeks of fall, the little cabin began, slowly, to disappear. She cut the dried stalks and bound them into thick bundles with cord. Then she pressed those bundles against the outer walls. The heavy stems formed the base of each layer. The thinner stalks filled the gaps between. The broad, dry seed heads were woven into the open spaces the way a mason fits stone into a rising wall. Wren carried armload after armload of dried plants from one side of the house to the other, her small arms full, her face set with the same quiet purpose as her grandmother's. Barley followed wherever the work went, settling himself in whatever patch of thin autumn sun he could find. Layer by layer, the gray logs vanished behind a dense skin of stalk and leaf and fiber and trapped air. And here was the very thing the carpenter had never understood. Nell was not building a solid wall. A solid wall would only have carried the cold straight through to the logs beneath. She had seen that too in her long life. Walls built so tight and hard they froze a sleeping family right through to the bone. No, what she was building was full of tiny spaces, 1,000 small pockets, where the cold air would lose its way, where the wind would wear itself out wandering, and never once find a straight road through to the wood beneath, loose enough to breathe, thick enough to hold. It was not a thing a person could understand just by looking at it. It was a thing a person could only ever come to understand by living through a hard winter inside it. And then, just as she had feared in the dark of that long night, the trouble came. Not the way the carpenter had warned, not all at once. It came of all things as a warm spell. A few strange, mild days, far too soft for the season. The air went heavy and damp, and a slow, soaking wet settled down over everything and would not lift. It crept into the new-built skin, and one gray morning, it was Wren who found it. She had been packing a low section of the western wall when she stopped and frowned and called for her grandmother in a small, worried voice. The bundles there were wet, not just damp at the surface. Wet clear through, where the warm spell had soaked them and the cold had not yet come along to freeze them dry. And down low, against the logs, where the water had pooled and could not run off. The wood was starting to darken, to soften, to rot. Nell knelt down stiff in the cold mud and pressed her thumb against the log, and felt it give, just slightly, just enough. It was exactly what Abel Caro had promised her it would be. Wet gets in the wood. Wood rots. For one long, terrible moment, the doubt came roaring back up out of the dark where she had buried it. He was right, she thought. He was right, and I was wrong. And now the house, the child, the whole of it. But she did not let the thought finish, because somewhere underneath the cold rush of fear, the old woman's voice was waiting for her again. Not with the same words this time, with something deeper than words, the shape of the thing behind them. The old people had not simply stacked their stocks and walked away whistling. They had known about the wet. They had built for it. And slowly, kneeling there in the cold damp of that gray morning, her knees aching against the ground, Nell began to remember how. She pulled the whole soaked section apart. Hours upon hours of work, undone in a single morning. The wet bundles dragged away and set aside. The darkened logs laid bare to the moving air, to dry. And then she built it back, differently. This time she left a narrow gap at the very base of the wall. A hidden channel tucked behind the outer bundles, where any water that found its way in could run down and out, instead of pooling against the wood and eating it away. A way for the wall to drain. A way for it to breathe at the bottom, just exactly as the carpenter had insisted it must. And up through the lower layers, into all the vulnerable places near the ground, she packed thick handfuls of dried sage and sweet grass she had gathered from the high country. Fragrant, dry, the kind of thing that kept the damp from settling in. And, she suspected, kept more than the damp away besides. The work took days she did not feel she could spare. It cost her labor her old body could barely give. But when it was finally done, the wall was no longer simply a wall. It had a way now to shed the wet. It had a way to dry itself out. It had learned, just like the Western row before it, how to take a hard blow and come back from it stronger than before. Wren stood and watched her grandmother step back to look at the finished section. "Is it fixed now, Grandma?" the child asked softly. Nell was quiet a moment, her tired eyes moving over the work. "It's better than fixed," she said. "It's ready." And she meant it, clear down to her bones, because the warm spell had not beaten her. It had taught her. Every failure had handed her something that success alone never could have. The wind had taught the rows to lean on one another. The wet had taught the wall how to breathe. Each trouble had taken something from her, and given back something worth a great deal more. That night, for the first time in a long string of sleepless nights, Nell Bramwell did not lie awake with her doubt. She slept, deep and easy, and without dreaming. And outside, in the deepening cold, the strange skin around the little cabin sat waiting in the dark. Thicker now, wiser now, full of all that trapped and patient air, waiting for the only test that would ever truly matter. But that test was still coming, and it was coming harder and colder and crueler than anyone in that whole valley, laughing or doubting or threatening, had the faintest idea. By the time the work was truly finished, the little cabin had all but vanished from the world. The sunflower skin wrapped it from the foundation logs clear up to the eaves. In most places, the layer was thick as a grown man's reach, packed firm enough to hold through any weather, yet loose enough to keep that whole hidden maze of still air alive within. From the road, the old gray walls were simply gone. Only the chimney still showed itself plainly, a lone finger of stone rising up out of the strange mass. A narrow doorway broke the line of stalks. A window or two could just be made out, peering through the woven layers like eyes behind a veil. Everything else seemed buried beneath a shell that had grown straight up out of the summer soil. Folks slowed their wagons to stare at it. They had no name for what they were looking at. It was not a house exactly. It was not a haystack either. It was something stranger than both, something nobody in the whole valley had ever seen rise up beside a person's home before. And of course, they laughed, because that is what people do so often when they meet a thing they cannot understand. They do not lean in close to learn it. They stand back, and they laugh. Cyrus Dunmore got his first good look at the finished thing late one gray afternoon, and he laughed loud enough that 3 men nearby turned to find out what was so funny. "She's gone and turned her cabin into the biggest haystack in the whole valley," he said. The men laughed along with him. A couple of them smiled and walked on, shaking their heads. The new name was spreading before the sun was even down behind the high ground. The Haystack Widow, some of them called her now. Nell heard it. She heard all of it. The valley was far too small for a thing like that to stay quiet for long. She was standing beside the north wall, tightening one last length of cord, with hands that had not been free of ache in months, when the laughter carried across the cold air to where she worked. She did not turn around. Wren stood beside her, small jaw set hard, eyes flashing. "Why do they laugh at us, Grandma?" Nell tied off the cord, slow and careful. "Because they can see the flowers," she said, "and they can't see the winter yet." The child turned that over in her mind. "And when they can see the winter?" This time, Nell almost smiled. "Then they'll stop laughing," she said, all of them, at the very same time. She rested her worn hand a moment on the child's shoulder. "Hold on to that," she said softly. "When folks laugh at you, Wren, it doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it only means you're early." The child looked up at her grandmother, and though she did not fully understand it yet, she filed those words away, somewhere deep, the way children do with the things that will matter to them later. Around that same stretch of days, 2 new objects appeared inside the little cabin. The first was a slender glass tube hung on the wall across the room from the stove, where the heat of the fire could not reach to fool it. A thing for measuring the cold, for putting a hard number to a thing that most folks only ever felt. The second was a small book with a worn leather cover, and every few days Nell would sit at the rough table by lamplight after the child was asleep, and she would open that book, and she would write in it, by the careful light of the flame, the cold of the morning, the cold of the deep night, how much wood the stove had eaten, how many times the fire had needed feeding through the dark hours, plain numbers, plain facts, set down in a steady, patient hand. To anyone who saw her at it, it looked like the strangest waste of time of all. Most folks did not measure winter. They simply endured it the way their fathers had, and their fathers before them, hunched in close to the fire, counting off the long days until the thaw. Cyrus Dunmore certainly saw no sense in the book. He came by once more before the deep cold settled in, on the matter of an account that did not really need settling, and his eye fell on the little book lying open there on the table. He let out a short laugh through his nose. "You can fill that whole book with numbers from now until spring," he said. "Won't change the weather by so much as a breath." Nell did not look up from her writing. "It isn't meant to change the weather," she said quietly. "Then what earthly good is it?" She set down her pen at last and looked at him. "It's meant to tell the truth," she said, when all the talking's finally done. Cyrus Dunmore did not have an answer to that. He left her cabin without one, and the little book kept right on filling, line by patient line, while out beyond the walls the cold drew closer to the valley with every passing day. The world had begun to send its own warnings now. Quiet ones, the kind a body has to know how to read. The grass had lost its color and gone the dull brown of old straw. Thin sheets of ice held on in the shaded places long past sunrise, where in other years they would have melted clean away by mid-morning. Each new day seemed to come a shade colder than the one before it. There was an old man in the valley named Silas Tanner. He did not say much. He never had in all his long years. But folks had learned over time to watch where the old man was watching, because Silas Tanner could read a sky the way other men read print on a page. And that fall, the old man spent a great deal of his time looking north. The ice came to the edge of the still water far earlier than it ever should have, and once it came, it did not go. Snow showed itself on the high ground and stayed put, where in any ordinary year a few warm days would have cleared it clean off before the real cold ever arrived. The elk came down out of the high country weeks before their proper time, moving low and uneasy through the foothills, the way animals always move when something they cannot name is coming up the trail behind them. And then the geese left, all at once it seemed. One gray morning the whole sky was full of their crying. Ragged lines of them stretched from one horizon to the other. And by the next morning, the sky was empty and silent. And somehow the silence was worse than all the crying had been. After that, the valley grew quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Even at the trading post, where the talk and the laughter never seemed to stop the whole year round, men had begun to fall still when old Silas walked in out of the cold. They watched his face. They watched where his eyes went, because deep down, every last one of them had started to know. The winter that was coming for the valley was not going to be an ordinary winter. Around the Bramwell place, something had changed too. Barley no longer slept out on the porch the way he had all the warm months long. Each evening now he scratched at the door until Nell let him in, and then he settled himself just inside the threshold, down low, near the foot of the north wall. And in the deep of the night, sometimes, the old dog would lift his gray head from his paws. He would turn it slow toward the north wall, ears pricked forward, and he would stare at the dark logs there, long and unblinking, as though he were listening to something still far, far away, out beyond the reach of any human ear. Nell noticed it. She noticed everything now. the way a body does when it has already lost too much and made up its mind never to be caught unready again. One bitter night, a hard wind came rolling down off the high ground and ran through the valley for hours on end. It pushed and tore and rattled at every door in the basin, prying, testing, looking for a way in. The cabin held. The bindings held. In the gray of morning, nothing looked the least bit out of place. Not a single stalk seemed disturbed. And yet, all through that long howling night, Barley would not settle. He paced up and down the inside of the north wall, again and again, his nails clicking soft on the floorboards. Several times he stopped at the very same spot, dropped low, and pressed his nose hard against the base of the logs. Then he would move off, only to circle back to that very same place a few minutes later, restless, troubled, certain of something the woman could not yet see. By the gray light of dawn, Nell had given up on sleep. She rose, stiff and cold, and pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, and went out into the bitter half-dark to walk the wall. She walked it slow. She ran her chapped hands over every bundle. She tested every tie. She checked every layer of stalk along the north side where the old dog had paced and would not rest. At first, she found nothing at all. The wall stood just as it should, firm, whole, not a gap her tired eyes could find anywhere along its length. And then she found it, hidden away behind the outer layer in a place no one would ever have thought to look. A narrow hollow, long as her arm and longer. A space where the bundles had quietly settled, just enough to pull a little apart, leaving an open channel running between the sunflower skin and the cabin logs beneath. From the outside, it was invisible. The stalks lay over it perfectly. 100 people could have walked the length of that wall and never once known it was there. But Nell knew at once exactly what it was. It was a road for the cold. A place where the moving air, instead of losing itself the way she had built it to do, could gather and run and pick up its strength again and come pouring straight through to the wood with all its cruelty still in it. It was a gap, a small, hidden, perfect gap. And she stood there in the freezing half-light, staring down into it. And the bottom dropped clean out of her, because she had known a gap like this one before, not with her eyes, with everything else she had. She had felt it on a night long gone, in a cabin she had not been able to save, a small hidden weakness that no living soul had known was there, a place where the cold had quietly found its road in, while a family slept warm and trusting on the other side, certain, so certain, that the walls around them would hold through the night. A weakness just like this one had let the cold reach a strong man's home. A weakness just like this one had emptied a woodpile in the dark and sent that man pulling on his heavy wool coat out into the teeth of a storm to find more. A weakness just like this one had taken Asa from her. Nell pressed her palm flat against the cold logs, and she closed her eyes. And for one long moment, she was not an old woman standing beside a strange wall in the frost. She was a younger woman in another doorway on another bitter night, watching a man she loved shrug into his coat, telling him to hurry, to mind his footing, to come back quick, telling him she would keep the fire burning bright till he did. She had kept the fire. She had kept it all that long night through, and it had not been enough. Because no fire on earth can warm a house the cold has already found its way inside of. Not again, she whispered to the gray morning, her breath clouding white in the freezing air. Not this house, not this child, not ever again. And then she opened her eyes, and she began to take the wall apart. Wren found her there an hour later. The bundles were already coming down. The bindings were cut loose and scattered. Whole sections of the work her grandmother had labored over for endless weeks lay strewn across the frosted ground. "Grandma," the child cried out, her voice rising in alarm. "What are you doing? It was finished. You finished it." "It was not finished," Nell said, and she did not stop working. "It only looked finished. And there's a world of difference, child, between a thing that's done and a thing that only looks done." She rebuilt that whole stretch of the north wall from the bare frame on out, tighter this time, with the bundles packed so close, so deliberate, so cunningly fitted, that no settling on earth could ever open a road through them again. She closed the hollow. She broke that one long channel into 100 small dead ends, so that any cold creeping in would wander and find no straight way through to the wood. It took her the better part of the whole short day. Her hands went numb and then past numb, and still she worked. Wren carried the fresh bundles to her one at a time, her own small fingers gone red and stiff in the cold, and not once did the child complain. By the time the light began to fail in the west, the work was done again. Wren stepped back and looked at it, and frowned hard. "It looks exactly the same as it did before," she said. Nell tightened one final length of cord, and stepped back to stand beside her granddaughter. For a long moment she said nothing at all. She only stood there, her head tilted just slightly, as if she were listening to something far off, beyond the ridgeline, beyond the gray edge of the failing world. Then, at last, she answered. "The wind will know," she said. The child looked at the wall again. She studied it long and hard, and try as she might, she could not see a single thing about it that was different from before. But some of the most important changes a person ever makes in this life are the ones that nobody else can see, right up until the day the weather comes to test them. It was the very next morning that old Silas Tanner came to the Bramwell place. No one had sent for him. No one had asked him to come. He simply rode up out of the cold gray morning, slow on his old horse, and climbed down stiff, and stood there a good long while, looking at the strange wrapped cabin without saying a single word. Nell came out to meet him, bracing herself for more of what she'd had all season. A laugh, a warning, some clever joke at her expense to carry back to the others. But the old man did not laugh. He walked all the way around the structure, slow and careful, his sharp old eyes traveling over the bundles, the bindings, the great thickness of it, the cunning way the layer sat held away from the logs. He stopped at each corner and looked close. He pressed a weathered hand flat to the surface and felt the give of it under his palm. He took his time, the way a man takes his time over a thing he has decided to respect. For the first time since the very first seed had gone into the cold ground that distant spring, someone with real weather behind his eyes was studying the sunflower wall, without amusement, without scorn, without a single joke ready and waiting on his tongue. At last, the old man came to a stop near the narrow doorway. He turned to face her. "Who taught you this?" he asked. And Nell looked at the weathered stalks, at the work of her own two ruined hands, at the long memory standing silent behind it all. "My husband's mother," she said. "A long time ago now. She came from the old country, from a place where the winters were the kind that taught you, or buried you." Silas Tanner nodded, once, slow and grave. He did not lecture her. He did not praise her, either. He simply stood there a moment longer, and then he turned his old eyes north, toward the high ground, where the mountains themselves had begun to disappear behind a thick and thickening curtain of gray. He looked at that gray a long, long time. And when he finally climbed back up onto his horse, the stillness in his face made the cold feel suddenly closer and crueler than it had a moment before. He did not say goodbye. He only paused, with the worn reins gathered in his stiff old hands, and he spoke without turning back around. "Whatever's coming down out of that," the old man said, "is going to be hungry for walls." And then he rode away, north to south, bent low against the wind. And he never once looked back. He did not laugh. That was the thing the whole valley would remember long afterward. Not the words he spoke, the thing he did not do. A man who understood the sky the way few men ever had stood and studied the haystack widow's foolish wall, long and slow and careful as a judge. And he had not laughed. The cold came 3 days after that. It did not come the gentle way that ordinary cold comes, creeping down a degree at a time, granting folks the grace of warning, the time to ready themselves and their homes. It came all at once. The morning began quiet, far too quiet. The kind of held-breath stillness that settles over a valley and makes the hair stand up on the back of a person's neck without their knowing why. By midday, the light had gone strange and flat. The color seemed to drain right out of the world. The sky pressed down low and gray and heavy over the high ground, sagging like a thing about to give way. And then the cold dropped. It fell out of that low sky like something with a will and a mind of its own. It swept down off the north country and came pouring into the valley faster and harder than any living soul could ever remember it falling before. Folks moved fast then. Ranch hands drove the animals toward shelter, shouting against a wind that was rising by the minute. Wagons cleared off the roads. Doors were dragged shut and barred. Windows were checked one last frantic time and then forgotten. And the wind came on, hard, fast, and utterly without mercy. It did not drift the snow down gently from above the way snow is meant to fall. It drove it sideways, in long white sheets that raced flat across the open country and swallowed the whole world up a piece at a time. The fence lines vanished first, then the barns, then whole homesteads, one after another, disappearing behind the wall of white, until a body standing in his own dooryard could scarcely make out the end of his own outstretched arm. By the failing of the light, the entire valley seemed to have been simply erased, wiped clean off the face of the earth as though it had never been there at all. And the wind did not weaken with the coming of the dark. It built, hour upon hour upon hour. The great low roar of it pressed against every wall in the basin, searching, the way it always searched, for the smallest, meanest way in. A way under a door, a crack in old shrunken chinking. A gap that no one had ever known was there. Inside their homes, all across the buried valley, people fed their fires and pulled their blankets close and listened to that roar and felt the cold pressing nearer with every passing hour, no matter how high they built the flames. And out at the very edge of it all, a little cabin sat wrapped in its strange skin of stalk and seed and waiting air. Waiting. The laughter was over now. The names, the doubts, the threats, the careful warnings from the carpenter, the cold scorn from the man with the book, the long and lonely nights of a widow on her knees in the frozen dirt with no one left in all the world to ask whether she was right or wrong. Every last bit of it had come down, at the end of everything, to this: one wall, one winter, and the only judge whose verdict had ever truly mattered had finally come down out of the North Country to render it. It would not be hurried. It would not be reasoned with, or bargained with, or begged, and it would not be kind. The first night of the storm, the valley learned the difference between two kinds of houses, not the difference between rich and poor, not between fine work and rough, the difference between a house that fought the cold and a house that had already made its peace with it, long before the first flake ever fell. Inside the little wrapped cabin, the world was a strange and quiet place. The great roar of the storm was still out there. A body could hear it, but it arrived softened, stripped of its sharpest edges, as if it were happening somewhere far off, on the other side of something thick and deep and patient. The lamp burned steady on the table. The stove burned low, the way it always burned, no harder tonight than on any ordinary cold evening. And on the wall across the room, the slender glass tube held its line. It did not climb. It did not fall. It simply held. Wren sat at the table in the warm yellow light, a blanket round her shoulders more from habit than need, turning the pages of an old, worn book. Every now and again she turned one. That was all. Nothing in the way the child sat or breathed suggested a girl trapped inside a house under siege by the worst the sky could throw. Barley lay stretched out beside the stove, one ear folded down over his face, deep in the kind of sleep only an old dog who feels truly safe can manage. And Nell sat near the lamp, her ruined hands resting at last in her lap, and listened to the storm she had spent a whole long year preparing for. It could not get in. She had built it so it could not get in. She rose once, sometime in the deep of that first night, and crossed to the wall and laid her hand flat against the inner logs. The wood under her palm was warm, quietly, stubbornly warm, while every other wall in the valley was giving its heat away to the dark, log by log, breath by breath. She left her hand there a long moment and felt the whole year of work answer her back through the grain of the wood. Something loosened in her chest that had been clenched tight since the first seed went into the ground. Not triumph. It was too quiet for triumph. It was more like the feeling of a long-held breath, finally let go. "Grandma," Wren said softly from the table, "is the storm going to get us?" Nell turned. She looked at the child in the lamplight, at the small face that trusted her so completely, at the same small face she had lain awake so many nights, terrified of failing. "No, sweet girl," she said, and for the first time in a long, long while, she said it without a single thread of doubt running underneath. "No, the storm is not going to get us. We told it where to go, and it listened. Wren considered this. Because of the flowers? Nell crossed the room and sat down beside her and drew the child gently into the curve of her arm. Because of the flowers, she said. Because of the wind that knocked them down, and we stood them back up. Because of the wet that tried to rot them, and we taught them to breathe. Because of a gap an old dog found in the dark that nobody else could see. She kissed the top of the child's head. All of it, Wren. Every hard part. Every night the work fell down and we built it back up again. That's what's keeping you warm tonight. Not the easy parts. The hard ones. The child leaned into her, quiet. And the storm howled on, far away, on the other side of the wall, unable to reach a single hair on her head. 300 steps off, another cabin faced the very same storm, the same wind, the same driving snow, the same long, screaming dark, and yet the night inside it could not have been more different. It belonged to a man named Ezra Holloway, a good man, a hard worker, a man who kept his place tidy and his fences mended and his family fed. But the cold that night did not care how good a man Ezra Holloway was. It found the weaknesses his house had carried for years without anyone noticing. It pushed in under the front door, through a crack that had seemed too small to matter. It slipped into the chinking that had shrunk away in the summer heat. It found a narrow gap near the corner of a window frame that no one had ever thought twice about. Each opening was nothing on its own. Together, they became an invasion. As the dark came down, frost began to creep along the inside of the walls. Thin white lines at first, tracing the seams of the logs. By the deep of the night, whole patches of ice had spread across the timber nearest the north side, glittering cruel in the lamplight. The stove burned and burned. Ezra Holloway fed it through the night, log after precious log, and still the cold pressed in. His wife pulled every blanket in the house down off the beds and wrapped the children in them, layer on layer, and still the little ones curled tight and shivered. Every few hours, Ezra rose and checked the woodpile stacked inside against the wall. And every few hours, it was smaller. He did the arithmetic in his head the way a frightened man does, over and over, hoping the numbers will come out different. How much wood was left? How long the storm might last? How fast the one was vanishing against the other? The numbers did not come out the way he needed them to. He said nothing of this to his wife. He only fed the fire and watched the woodpile shrink and listened to the wind and waited for a morning that felt as though it might never come. And somewhere in that long, cold dark, his thoughts wandered against his will to the strange, wrapped cabin just down the road, the one they had all laughed at, the haystack widow's place. He found himself wondering, in the bitter dark, whether the old woman and the little girl were even still alive over there, or whether the cold had already taken them both, buried in their foolish wall of dead flowers. He could not have known, he could not have guessed, that at that very hour, in that very cabin, a child was sleeping easy under a single blanket, while the warm logs held their heat, and an old woman sat watching the line on a glass tube refuse to fall. 2 houses, the same storm. 2 entirely different verdicts being written hour by hour in the long dark. Sometime in the deepest part of that first night, Nell did a strange thing. She put on her shawl and she opened the cabin door just for a moment to look upon her wall in the storm. The wind hit her at once, hard enough to steal the breath from her lungs. Snow swirled wild through the black. The cold was a living, clawing thing. And yet, the wall stood. A thick, white crust of snow had built up across the whole outer face of the sunflower skin. The wind had packed it into every gap between the stalks. Ice had locked the loose fibers together into something hard and whole. It did not look like a wall of dead flowers anymore. It looked like part of the land itself, like a great drift the earth had thrown up to shield one small house from the worst of the sky. And what mattered most was happening where no eye could see it. The storm struck that outer crust first. And instead of reaching the cabin as one great driving force, the wind was being torn apart, broken into 1,000 smaller pieces by all those stalks and seed heads and pockets of trapped air. Large currents became small ones. Small ones crashed into one another and scattered and lost their way. By the time the air found the logs hidden underneath, it had nothing left. The heat stayed where it belonged, and the snow itself, packed deep into the sunflower skin, had become a help instead of a harm. Frozen into the layer, it had turned into one more blanket, adding its own strength right where the storm had expected to find weakness. Months ago, they had looked at this and seen dead flowers, wasted daylight, a foolish old woman chasing a fancy to fill an empty house, and the storm, even now, was hammering at the cabin to test every one of those judgments. And the answer was coming back, hour by hour, plain as the line on the glass. The wall was doing exactly the thing it had been built to do. It was not stopping the winter. Nothing on this earth could stop the winter. It was making the winter spend itself, wearing it down, forcing it to throw away all its strength out there in the dark against a shield grown from one summer's soil long before it could ever reach the family sleeping warm within. Nell pulled the door shut against the screaming cold. She crossed to the table and she opened her little book, and by lamplight she wrote down one more line. The cold of the night. The wood that had been burned. The hour. Plain numbers. Plain facts. The truth being set down quietly for the day when all the talking would finally be done. The storm did not break with the morning. It deepened. The second night came on harder than the first, the wind rising to a pitch that seemed almost alive, almost angry, as if the cold had taken the measure of the valley and meant now to break whatever was left. And it was in the worst hour of that second night that the pounding came. At first, Nell thought it was only the storm, a loose thing somewhere, thrown against the wall. She did not move. Then it came again. A fist. On the door. Frantic and failing and unmistakable. Barley was up at once, a low warning sound in his chest. Wren stirred under her blanket. Nell rose, crossed the room, and pulled the heavy door open against the wind. And there, on her threshold, half buried in driven snow, his face gone gray and his lips gone blue with cold, stood Cyrus Dunmore, the man with the book, the man who had sat on his horse in her dooryard and told her she would come crawling to his counter when the cold came, the man who had threatened to let a child go hungry to win an argument about flowers. He stood now in her doorway, shaking, barely able to keep his feet, and behind him, clutched against the storm, were two more shapes. A woman, her arms wrapped tight around a small bundle, and inside that bundle, a child, a little one, far too still. "My house," Dunmore gasped, the words torn half away by the wind. The roof. The cold got in. The fire couldn't. He could barely speak for shivering. There's nowhere else. Everything's buried. Yours was the only light. The girl. The baby. Please. The proudest man in the valley, standing on the threshold of the woman he had tried to break, begging. For a single heartbeat, Nell did not move, and in that one frozen heartbeat, a whole world of things passed behind her eyes. The laughter, the name he had given her, the way he had spoken of the child, deliberate, cruel. The long nights of doubt his threat had cost her. The promise he had made to let her grandchild go without. She had every right in this world to remember all of it. She had every right to let the cold finish the argument he himself had started. She stood there one heartbeat longer, and then Nell Bramwell stepped back and pulled the door wide, and her voice when it came was low and steady and held not one drop of anything but mercy. "Bring the child in," she said. "Bring her to the fire. Now." They came in out of the dark in a stumble of snow and cold. The wind tried to follow them, howling, and Nell shouldered the heavy door closed against it and shut the storm back out where it belonged. And then she went to work. She took the small, still bundle from the woman's frozen arms and carried it close to the stove and began to chafe the little one's hands and feet, slow and steady, the way a woman who has tended the dying and the newborn both knows how to do. "Wren," she said, calm as still water, "blankets, the ones from my bed, and put the kettle on." The child was already moving. Nell rubbed warmth back into the baby's small, cold limbs and murmured low to her the whole while, and after a long and terrible stretch of minutes, the little one stirred and whimpered and began at last to cry. The thin, furious cry of a child who has decided to live. It was the most welcome sound in the world. The mother broke down at the sound of it, weeping into her hands. Nell wrapped the baby warm and pressed her back into her mother's arms and set the woman down close to the stove and put a hot cup into her shaking fingers. And only then did she turn to Cyrus Dunmore. He stood near the door where he had stopped, still in his snow-caked coat, watching her work with an expression she had never once seen on his face before. He looked at the warm logs. He looked at the sleeping dog. He looked at the child who had risen without a word to fetch blankets, at the second child now crying healthy in her mother's arms, at the slender glass tube on the wall holding its steady line while the whole valley froze, and the hard, certain mask he had worn all season long cracked. "Sit down by the fire," Nell told him, not unkind, but not soft either. "Before you fall down. You're no good to your family frozen." He sat. The proud man sat down at the widow's fire in the widow's warm and foolish cabin, and for a long while he could not seem to find any words at all. Nell put a cup in his hands too. He held it, but did not drink. He stared into the flames, and then, in a voice gone rough and low, the man with the book began to speak. "You should have left me out there," he said. Nell said nothing. She only waited. "You should have let me freeze on your step," Dunmore went on, "for what I've done. You don't know. You don't know what I've done." "Then say it," Nell said quietly, "if it's eating you so." For a long moment, the only sound was the crying of the baby, settling now, and the low roar of the storm outside, and the snap of the fire. And then it came out of him. The winter your husband died, he said, and Nell went very still. That night, the bad one. Dunmore's hands shook around the cup, and not from the cold now. He came to me, Asa, out in the dark, in the worst of it. His woodpile was gone. His fire was failing. He came to me because I was the only man for miles, with cordwood put by to spare. He asked for an armload, just an armload. Said he'd settle up come spring, and he was good for it. He always was. He stopped. He could not look at her, and I turned him away. The fire popped. The wind screamed. There was an old quarrel between us, Dunmore said. A foolish thing. A piece of land. A few hard words. Years back. Nothing that should have mattered against a man's life. But I was proud. And I was warm in my bed and didn't want to dress and go out to the woodshed for a man I'd decided to hold a grudge against. His voice broke. So I told him no. I told him to come back in the morning when I'd had my sleep. And I shut my door on him. And he went back out into that storm to find wood some other way. He finally lifted his eyes to hers. They were wet and ruined and full of a thing that had been gnawing at him for longer than anyone had known. He never made it home. You know that better than anyone alive. And I have known every single day since that if I had only opened my door that night, only handed a freezing man an armload of wood, he would have lived. Your husband would have lived. And that child would still have her people. The whole room had gone silent, save the fire and the storm. That's why I came at you so hard all season, Dunmore said, the words tumbling out now, ugly and honest. The flowers, the names, the threats. Every time I looked at you out there, building your wall, trying so hard to keep the cold from ever taking anyone again. I saw what I'd done. I saw the door I shut, and I couldn't stand it. So I tried to make you stop. I tried to make you a fool, so I wouldn't have to look at what I was. He set the cup down with a hand that would not be still. My scorn was never about your flowers, he said. It was about my guilt. And tonight the cold came for my own family. And the only door in this whole valley that opened for us was yours. The one I tried hardest to shut. He bowed his gray head. You should have left me out there, he said again, barely a whisper. It would have been just. And Nell Bramwell sat in the warm cabin she had grown out of grief and dead flowers, and she looked at the broken man who had taken her husband from her through nothing more than a closed door and a hard, proud heart. She had waited years for an answer to a question she had never even known she was asking. Now she had it, and she found, to her own quiet wonder, that the thing rising up in her was not the thing she would have expected. It was not hatred. The hatred had no room left to stand. Not in a house this warm. Not with a saved child crying healthy by the fire, and an old dog asleep, and a granddaughter watching her grandmother's face to learn, in this very moment, what a person is supposed to do with a wound like this one. That was the thing that decided her. The child was watching. Wren stood by the stove, the blanket still in her arms, her eyes huge, taking in every word, every silence, learning right now what it meant to be the kind of person her grandmother was. And Nell understood that whatever she said next, the child would carry it for the rest of her life. You're right, Nell said at last. Her voice was rough, but it did not waver. It would have been just to leave you out there, just and easy, and I'd have had every right. Dunmore did not lift his head. "But I have spent a whole year of my life," she went on, "growing a wall to keep the cold from taking one more soul. And I'll be damned if the first thing I do with it is use it to let the cold take you." He looked up at her then. "I can't give you back what your door cost me," she said. "No one can. Asa's gone, and no forgiving of mine will bring him through that door again. But your guilt won't bring him back either. It only built you a cold house of your own all these years, colder than any storm could make it." She drew a slow breath. "So I'm going to do the thing you didn't," she said. "I'm going to open my door and keep your family warm and ask nothing for it. Not because you've earned it. You haven't. But because that's what the wall is for." The fire snapped. Outside, the storm raged on, unknowing, undefeated, hammering at a shield it could not break. And inside, in the warm and golden light, a man who had carried a frozen door in his chest for years finally began, quietly, to weep. Not from the cold, from the unbearable, undeserved warmth of being forgiven. His wife reached over and took his shaking hand. The baby slept. The old dog sighed in his dreams, and Wren, watching it all from beside the stove, set the blankets down and came and pressed herself against her grandmother's side and held on. She did not understand all of it. She was too young for all of it, but she understood the shape of the thing she had just seen. That the strongest wall a person can build is not the one that keeps the world out. It is the one that can still, after everything, choose to open its door. And so the long second night of the storm wore on toward morning. 5 souls and an old dog, warm inside a wall of flowers, while the cold spent the last of its fury in the dark and found, at the end of all its searching, that there was one house in the valley it simply could not reach. The wall had done its work. But that night, it turned out, the wall had done more than keep the cold from the wood. It had kept a child alive who was not even its own. It had opened for an enemy, and it had taught a watching little girl the deepest lesson it had to give, that the things we build to survive our grief are only truly finished the day we use them to shelter someone else. The storm broke just before dawn. It did not fade slowly, the way storms in gentler seasons fade. It simply stopped. One moment the wind was still screaming against the wall, the way it had screamed for 2 days and 2 nights. And the next, there was nothing. A silence so deep and so sudden that it woke everyone in the little cabin at once. Nell rose first. She went to the small window and rubbed the frost from the glass and looked out at a world made entirely new. The valley lay buried under white, smooth and deep and unbroken, glittering pale blue in the first gray light, every harsh edge of the land softened and hidden. The fences were gone. The road was gone. The familiar shapes of the world had all been swallowed under the drifts. It was, in its terrible way, beautiful. And it was utterly, completely silent. Behind her, the cabin stirred to life. The baby woke and fussed and was hushed. The mother sat up, blinking, and for a moment did not seem to remember where she was, and then she did, and her hand went to her sleeping child, and her eyes filled. They were alive, all of them, a thing that 2 nights before had been very far from certain. Cyrus Dunmore woke last, stiff from a night in a hard chair by a fire that was not his own. He sat up slow. He looked around the warm room. He looked at his wife and his living child and the old woman at the window. And the man did not seem to know how to begin a single day in a world where he had been forgiven. He had no map for it. "The storm's done," Nell said, without turning from the window. "You'll want to get home and see what's left of your place. There'll be work." "Nell," Dunmore began. "There's nothing more to say this morning," she told him, gentle but firm. "What's said is said. What's done is done. The rest you'll show me, or you won't, in how you live. Words won't carry it now." And the strange thing was, he understood her. He gathered his family. He wrapped the baby warm in one of Nell's own blankets, and he did not ask whether he could keep it, and she did not offer. It simply went with them, the way such things do between people who have stopped keeping accounts with one another. At the door, before he stepped out into the buried white, Cyrus Dunmore stopped. He looked back at the old woman and the little girl and the warm room that had taken him in. "I won't forget this," he said. "Not the wall, not the fire." He swallowed hard. "Not the door." And then he was gone, out into the snow, breaking a slow trail home through drifts that came up past his knees, his family close behind him. Nell watched them go until the white swallowed them up. Then she shut the door against the cold and turned back to the warm room, and to the child, and to the ordinary work of a morning that, against every odd, had still come. It was Ezra Holloway who came down the road first, once a trail could be broken. He came on foot, floundering through the deep snow, because no horse could have managed it. He had spent the long hours since the storm broke digging his own door free, tending what was left of his half-frozen animals, and counting, with a sick heart, the last few sticks of his woodpile. His own house had barely held. New cracks had opened all along the north wall. Thin blades of daylight showed now through places that had been sealed tight before the storm. There had been an hour, in the worst of that second night, when he had truly believed his family might not see the morning. So he came down the road, expecting the worst. The widow's place had looked so fragile from the very beginning. A wall of dead flowers. 2 days of that screaming wind should have stripped it bare and scattered it across the valley. That was what everyone had always said would happen. And when the wrapped cabin finally came into view through the white, Ezra Holloway stopped walking. The wall was still there. The outer face of it showed the storm's fury, sure enough. Whole sections near the top had been flattened and torn. Stalks had been stripped away. Loose fibers hung frozen under thick crusts of snow and ice. But the core of it, the deep, dense layer hugging the logs, still stood. Whatever had been lost on purpose. The battered outer shell had taken the punishment, and everything behind it had come through whole. The cabin did not even look like a building anymore. It looked like a great soft mound of snow risen up out of the valley floor, a thing the land itself had made. And from the chimney rose a thin, steady ribbon of smoke, not the heavy black smoke of a stove being fed desperately against the cold. Just enough. The quiet smoke of a warm house going about its morning. Ezra Holloway stood in the snow and stared at that ribbon of smoke for a long, long time. Then he walked the rest of the way to the door, and he knocked. And when Nell opened it, warm air rolled out to meet him, and behind her He could see the child eating from a bowl at the table, and the old dog stretched out asleep by the stove, and no blankets piled on shivering shoulders, and no frost climbing the inner walls. No one in that house looked as though they had spent 2 days fighting for their lives. The difference was impossible to look away from. Ezra's eyes went first to the slender glass tube on the wall, then to the wood, stacked neat and barely touched along the inner wall. Then to the small worn book lying open on the table. Nell saw where his gaze had settled. Without a word, she picked up the book and held it out to him. He took it in his cold, stiff hands and turned the pages. He found the entries from the 2 days of the storm, the cold of each long night, the wood that had been burned. And then he thought of his own house, of the wood he had burned, log after precious log, nearly his whole winter store gone in 2 nights, of the cold that had crept in despite every stick of it. The numbers in his hands told him a thing that needed no explaining. This foolish house of flowers had stayed warm through the worst of it. On a fraction of the wood his own had burned, trying and failing to do the same. He closed the book slowly. Then he walked to the nearest wall, and he laid his bare palm flat against the inner logs. The wood was warm, not hot, not heated, just warm. Holding its own heat, 2 days into the cruelest cold the valley had ever known, the way a living thing holds its warmth. Ezra Holloway lowered his hand. He turned and looked at the old woman he had helped to laugh at all year long. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out quiet. They did not need to be loud. The winter had already finished the argument. When the trails were broken at last, the story moved through the valley again. But this time, no one laughed. They had heard about the warm wall and the book of numbers no man could argue with. And they had heard the other thing too, the thing that quieted them more than any wall ever could, that the proudest man among them had stumbled half frozen through the dark, and the one door that opened for him was the door he had tried hardest to shut. Because every one of them had laughed at her too, and every one of them knew now what kind of woman they had been laughing at. As for Cyrus Dunmore, the man came back changed, not all at once. Real change rarely comes all at once, but it came and it held, and the valley watched it come. He rebuilt his ruined house without a word of complaint, like a man who felt he had earned a hard season. And when the next cold came down, he loaded his wagon with cordwood and drove it out to the homes of the widows and the old and the struggling, the ones who in another year would have come to his counter with their hats in their hands. He did not charge them. He would only stack the wood neat against the wall and tip his hat and drive on. He settled the old quarrel too, gave the disputed land over free and clear, and asked nothing for it but the chance to shake an honest hand. And though no one but Nell and his own family ever knew the whole reason for it, the valley came in time to think a great deal more of Cyrus Dunmore than it ever had when he held their winters in his book. He had carried a closed door in his chest for years, and a widow's mercy, on the worst night of his life, had finally opened it. Spring came back to the valley, the way spring always comes. Slow at first, then all at once. The great drifts shrank and sagged and gave up the buried fences one rail at a time. The still water broke free of its ice. The first brave green pushed up through the brown along the low ground, and the air turned soft, and the long, terrible winter loosened its grip at last and let go. And when the season for planting came round again, Ezra Holloway surprised the whole valley. The first sunflower seeds he put in the ground that year did not go in a garden. They did not go along a fence where a man plants flowers to be looked at. They went against the walls of his house, tight against the logs, a narrow ring of them, circling the whole structure, exactly where Nell Bramwell had planted hers. A few folks noticed, most pretended not to, but the seeds went in all the same. By high summer, 2 more families had done the same. The year after that, there were 5. And the year after that, no one was counting anymore, because it had simply become a thing that people did. And the carpenter, Abel Caro, the man who had warned her about the wet and the rot and the mice, he came too. Not to admit he'd been wrong. He never quite said those words. He came instead the way good builders come to a thing that works. He studied it. He measured the spacing. He tested the bindings with his own rough hands. And the next fall, the cabins he raised began to go up with a place left for the flowers. Some of his warnings had been right all along. The wet, the mice. She had only had to grow past them. And that, in the end, was the whole difference between the two of them. He had stopped at what could go wrong. She had kept going until she found how to make it go right. The name changed, too. No one called it the Haystack Widow's Cabin anymore. No one called her foolish. The thing she had built had earned itself a new name, a name spoken with respect now all up and down the valley. They called it the Flower Wall. But the deepest change of all was the one that happened inside one small cabin. For the longest time, that house had held a kind of silence in it, a coat behind the door that no one touched, an old grief that sat in every corner like cold air that would not warm, the door that stayed shut. But something had shifted. The winter of the storm. Nell found, as the seasons turned, that she could speak of Asa now, to the child, out loud, without the words catching in her throat like they always had. She told Wren stories of him, the way he laughed, the way he'd whistle, off-key when he worked, the kind of man he had been before the cold took him. And the telling did not hurt the way she had always feared it would. It warmed. The grief did not vanish. Grief like that never fully vanishes. It only learns to sit quieter, to take up less of the room. But it stopped being a wound somewhere in there. It became a memory she could hold without bleeding. And the woman who had spent so many years certain that her own life was, in all the ways that mattered, already over, found that she had been wrong about that too. She was not alone anymore. The valley that had laughed at her now came to her door for counsel. How thick to build the layer, how to leave the gap for the wet to drain, how to keep the mice out with sage and sweet grass. She had become, without ever meaning to, the keeper of a thing the whole valley needed. The Dunmores came too, often, and not for advice. The baby Nell had warmed back to life that night, grew into a child who called the old woman by a fond name, and ran to her, and climbed into her lap as though she had always belonged there. In a way, she had. 2 families that grief and pride should have made enemies forever had been bound together instead, by one open door, into something that looked a great deal like kin. And so the empty house slowly filled again. Not the way it had once been full. You cannot have back the thing you lost, but full in a new way. a way Nell had never thought to hope for. In all those long years of building her wall alone, the years went on, the way years do. Barley grew old, older than a dog has any right to get. His muzzle went white as the winter snow, and his steps grew slow, and some afternoons he would sleep for hours in the patch of sun beneath the same window he had once paced beside in the dark, the night he found the gap that no one else could see. And then, one quiet season, the old dog slept and did not wake. They buried him near the wall he had guarded. Wren cried, and Nell held her, and they spoke of him the way Nell had learned to speak of Asa now. With sorrow, yes, but with warmth running all through it. The grief and the gladness, side by side, the way they always are in a life that has truly been lived. And Wren grew up. The watchful little girl who had carried seeds and bundles and blankets became a watchful young woman. She learned the wall by heart, every layer of it, the way her grandmother had once learned it from the memory of an old woman from the old country. And in time, the day came that comes to all of us, the day the keeper has to set the keeping down. Nell grew old, and then very old, and one gentle season she went the way Barley had gone, quiet and unafraid, in the warm house she had built with her own ruined hands. And it fell to Wren, grown now, to go through the small things a long life leaves behind. That was when she found the book, the little worn leather book, tucked away on a shelf, full of her grandmother's careful hand. Page after page of numbers, the cold of the morning, the cold of the night, the wood that had been burned. Wren sat down with it and turned the pages, and the tears came, but slow and soft, the way tears come for a thing you are glad to have had. And then she came to the entries from the great storm, the 2 days and 2 nights when she had been only a small girl, reading by lamplight while the world froze. And looking at those numbers now, as a grown woman, she finally understood what they were. She had always thought her grandmother was measuring the weather. She was not. A woman who has lost a husband to the cold does not count degrees for the sake of degrees. She counts them because each number is a promise kept. Each cold night survived is one more night the child is still alive. Each fire that did not fail is one more morning the small one wakes up warm. Her grandmother had not been keeping a record of the temperature. She had been keeping a record of every single night that she had managed to keep the cold from taking the last person she had left. The book was not a ledger of the weather. It was a ledger of love, a tally kept in the dark of a promise made to a coat behind a door. Not this child, not ever again. And every line in it had been kept. Wren closed the book and held it against her chest, and she sat a long while in the warm cabin, in the quiet, full to the brim with the knowledge of what she had been given, and by whom, and at what cost. And then she did the only thing there was left to do. She passed it on. She taught the wall to her own children in time, and to the children of the valley, the way it had always been taught. Not as a lecture, not as a lesson out of a book, but the old way, the true way, as a story told by the fire on a cold night, about a woman everyone had laughed at, about a wall of flowers no one understood, about a storm that came to prove her foolish, and proved her right instead, and about the night that wall opened its door to an enemy, and what that taught a watching little girl. and how it had warmed a valley that did not even know it was cold. She would always end it the same way, with the part her grandmother had told her, again and again, beside the fire, that when folks laugh at you, it doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it only means you're early, and that the strongest wall a person will ever build is not the one that keeps the whole hard world out. It is the one that, after everything, after all the loss, and all the doubt, and all the long cold nights alone, can still find it in itself to open. And somewhere in the valley, every spring, the children still plant their sunflowers tight against the walls. They do not always know why, but the walls keep them warm, and the warmth, like the story, like the love that started it all, goes quietly on.